Today, I'm going to cover the administrations of President Madison and Monroe, really, except for the War of 1812, which I'm going to discuss in a separate and individual lecture for it. So, we have to remember as Madison takes over, the American Republic is now entering its third decade. And now it has to find itself really engaging in the efforts of governance. The fervor of revolution has now cooled, but it's unclear as to exactly what direction this new republic is going to take and how it's going to make some of the preconceived notions of the Constitution continue to work. This is the end of the Jeffersonian age, and yet the country is still growing very much internally, while there continue to be major external shocks and pressure to the United States. And how it balances those things in a very changing world, we'll see throughout the Madison and Monroe administrations. So, when James Madison assumed the presidency after winning the election of 1808 and assuming the presidency in 1809, he wasn't a stranger to American power. He had already been the principal architect of the Constitution. He was a key voice in the Federalist Papers, and he had been Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. Madison was soft spoken and slightly built, and honestly, more of a scholar than a statesman, but he had a clear vision for the future of the Republic. His presidency opened amid international crises, but beyond foreign entanglements that would lead ultimately to war, Madison faced a lot of major questions about the nature of federal power and the limits of executive action. Following the War of 1812, Madison started to change his long held views about the scope of federal authority. He had once been a firm believer of limited central government, but the war had shown him the dangers of an unprepared federal central government and disunity. And so he emerged from the conflict with a new openness to nationalist ideas that honestly would have scared him in his younger years. So in 1815, he endorsed a national bank, the very institution that he had once helped to dismantle. And so the Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816, reflecting a new consensus about the need for centralized financial control, although this national bank as well won't last particularly long. He was also a big proponent now of protective tariffs. Protective tariffs at this stage were designed to protect native industry from external competition. In this specific instance, what we're talking about is sheltering new and growing American manufacturing from British competition. The Tariff of 1816, which he passed during his presidency, was the first explicitly protective tariff in American history. It marked a subtle shift in thought toward a government that could shape economic development, not only guard liberty. But finally, Madison supported federal funding for internal improvements, roads, canals, and infrastructure, but only cautiously. And he remained very much a stickler for constitutional principles. On his final day in office, Madison vetoed the bonus bill proposed by John C. Calhoun, which would have used bank profits to fund national infrastructure. While Madison supported the idea in principle, he didn't believe the Constitution gave Congress the power to do that. In his veto message, he called for a constitutional amendment to authorize that spending. If Madison was the philosopher president, James Monroe was the steady hand that followed him. Elected in 1816 after Madison served two terms, Monroe inherited a more confident and coherent nation. The bitter party divides of the 1790s had now softened. The Federalist Party, battered by its opposition to the war and its association with the now infamous Hartford Convention, was all but extinct. Monroe's election signaled the rise of a one party era, what newspapers would famously later on call the era of good feelings. But Monroe's years in office were not merely peaceful. They were foundational. The country expanded, consolidated, and began to craft a distinctive American identity that also dealt with the question of slavery. One of Monroe's earliest achievements was the acquisition of the state of Florida. For years, Spanish control over Florida had been weak. Seminole raids and runaways from slavery crossed its borders with impunity. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish territory in pursuit of these groups. Jackson's bold actions nearly provoked international crises, but Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, turned it into an opportunity. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 formally transferred Florida to the United States and defined the western boundary of the Louisiana Territory. It was a triumph of diplomacy. Domestically, Monroe presided over a nation stretching westward at an ever increasing pace. Settlers surged into new lands fueled by optimism and government land policies. New states entered the Union: Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois in 1818, and Alabama in 1819, changing the balance of power, but also raising serious questions about the expansion of American chattel slavery. Those tensions came to a head in 1820 when Missouri applied to enter the Union as a slave state. The ensuing debate threatened to fracture our new nation. In a country with 11 states that were free and 11 states that were slave, Missouri's entrance threatened to tip the balance. The result was the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would come in as a slave state, but Maine would be carved out of Massachusetts and become free. Going forward, slavery would be banned in the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 parallel in the line of latitude. This is actually the southern border of the state of Missouri. Monroe signed the compromise into law, forestalling the sectional crisis between slave states and free states, but of course, only temporarily. Most famously, Monroe's administration is remembered for a statement that shaped American foreign policy for generations: the Monroe Doctrine. In his second term in 1823, amid fears that European powers might try to reclaim the newly but struggling independent Latin American nations, Monroe addressed Congress with a bold and new message. The Western Hemisphere, he declared, was no longer open to European colonization, and any interference would be deemed by the United States as a threat to its own sovereignty, even if that intervention came in the southern tip of Argentina or Chile. Though its practical power was limited at the time, most European countries paid no attention to it. The Monroe Doctrine expressed for the first time a really powerful idea: that the United States was a protector of its own hemisphere, a sovereign power with its own sphere of influence to match those of growing European states. And thus, through Monroe, we see the very beginning of a truly American diplomatic self-assertion. The Madison and Monroe administrations together form essentially a bridge. This bridge is between the Revolutionary generation, the generation of Washington, generation of Jefferson, and then the later Jacksonian age. This age witnessed an expansion of federal institutions, the solidifying of American borders, and the very, very first tremors of sectional division.